The day of my son's birthday, he said something that cut me to my core: the best gift I could give him was to simply disappear from his life. I managed a small smile, turned silently, and left him to his celebration. An hour later, I was on the phone with the police, watching them surround my own yard to arrest my son. I was carefully holding a chocolate birthday cake in my left hand as I fumbled for the back door handle. 28 candles were waiting in the kitchen drawer, but I wanted to surprise Brandon first with this dessert I had made myself. Tucked under my right arm was a wrapped gift containing the vintage watch he had admired months ago, a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather. I could hear laughter through the glass door, the animated sound of my son's voice mixed with those of his guests. The April evening air smelled of barbecued burgers and beer, perfect for his 28th birthday party. I paused at the door, wanting to be sure I wasn't interrupting anything important. Through the glass, I saw Brandon standing by the grill with Mike and Jason. Samantha was sitting at a patio table, busy on her phone while other guests socialized. I heard Mike say that I had gone all out for the party, mentioning the new sound system, the premium beer, and even the catering. Brandon took a long drink from his bottle and replied that it was just me, Robert, trying to buy his affection as usual, thinking that money was a solution for everything. My hands froze, the cake and gift suddenly feeling heavy. Jason chimed in that at least I cared, mentioning his own father hadn't called him in 6 months, and said Brandon was better off. Brandon laughed, but there was no warmth in the sound. He complained that I was always nagging him about getting a job, moving out, and taking responsibility, as if I didn't understand how difficult the economy was. My fingers tightened around the cake plate as I watched him through the door, gesturing dismissively with his beer bottle. He told his friends that honestly, the best gift for him would be if I would just disappear from his life forever. He was tired of my lectures and control. Those words felt like a physical blow. I staggered back, almost dropping the cake, the weight of 28 years of birthdays, holidays, and memories suddenly collapsing into this moment of casual cruelty. Mike joked that I was so pushy, raising his bottle in a mocking salute. Jason snorted, suggesting I probably had Brandon's whole life planned out in a spreadsheet, since that's what engineers do. Brandon agreed, confirming that everything always had to be my way. I quickly stepped aside as he turned toward the house, pressing myself against the wall. I heard him say he sometimes wished I would just find somewhere else to be permanently. The gift slipped from under my arm, landing softly on the doormat, but I managed to catch it as my legs felt like giving out. The watch inside, my father's watch, suddenly seemed worthless. I overheard Samantha suggesting from her table that he could just move out, to which he replied with a sneer, asking with what money. He said I controlled everything and acted like he was still 12. He drained his beer and tossed the empty bottle into a trash can. More laughter followed as he said at least the free rent is good. I stood there, a 62-year-old man holding a birthday cake for a son who wanted me to disappear. The candles in the kitchen seemed pointless now. I thought back to his graduation party, where he'd introduced me as the guy who paid for everything, and to a Christmas morning where he'd barely looked up from his phone while opening gifts. I wondered if I had been this blind the entire time. I leaned against the door frame, trying to make sense of what I had just heard. Inside, my kitchen was decorated for the party I had planned. The gifts on the dining room table that I had spent weeks selecting suddenly felt like a joke. The party continued, everyone completely unaware of my presence. I backed away, the cake still trembling in my hands, the wrapped watch feeling like dead weight. I saw my son enjoying a party that I had funded, all while wishing I would disappear. My chest tightened with a feeling that was colder and more calculating than hurt. I thought about the house mortgage I had been paying for 5 years, the utilities, the insurance, the food, and the car he drove without permission, everything he took for granted while wishing I would vanish. As I turned toward the kitchen, my mind began to work differently. If Brandon wanted me gone so badly, perhaps it was time to grant his wish, but not in the way he expected. The cake and candles could wait. First, I had to make some phone calls. 10 minutes later, the birthday cake sat abandoned on the counter. I had paced back and forth, watching my son celebrate while processing the devastation of his words. Now, I walked back through the sliding door with purpose. I had no cake, no gift, and no pretense of a celebration, just a father demanding answers from his ungrateful son. Brandon was right where I had left him, still animated in conversation with his friends. As I approached, a few guests glanced my way, probably expecting another fatherly lecture about the music or the mess. I called out Brandon's name, and my voice cut through their laughter. He turned with the casual indifference of someone who had never faced real consequences. It was the same expression he had when I'd found him using my credit card or when neighbors complained about his parties. I asked if we could talk privately, but he replied that whatever I had heard was true and that I was interfering with his life, and everyone knew it. His directness stunned me. There was no shame, no attempt at an explanation, just brutal honesty. I asked how he could say that after everything I had done, and he replied that nobody had asked me to, and it was my choice to support him. His friends nodded in agreement as he said that I acted like he owed me something for decisions I had made. Mike stepped closer to Brandon's shoulder, agreeing with him and adding that parents choose to have children. The casual cruelty of his friend's words hit me even harder. I glanced at my backyard, paid for and maintained with my own money, and saw guests starting to notice our conversation. My voice was steady despite the rage building inside me. I said I had provided everything he needed for 28 years, but he shouted back that he had never asked for any of it. He said I wanted gratitude for things he never requested and that it was my problem, not his. Jason laughed sharply, saying it was a boomer mentality, the idea that since I had sacrificed, he owed me. The guests formed a circle around our confrontation. Some looked uncomfortable, but none intervened. For them, it was just entertainment. I asked him if he meant what he said earlier about wishing I would disappear. For a moment, his eyes showed a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected me to know the exact words, but it was quickly replaced by defensive aggression. He confirmed that he had meant it, saying that I hovered, lectured, and made everything about my own expectations. He gestured with his beer bottle as he spoke, splashing droplets onto the patio. He said that maybe if I found my own life instead of trying to control his, we would both be happier. The crowd had grown larger, their conversations silenced. I felt their eyes on me, the controlling father who couldn't let his adult son live freely. I said that his house, food, and car were all provided by someone he wished would disappear. He agreed with a smile, saying he would miss the free rent for about 5 minutes before he figured something else out. Samantha giggled from her table, saying he was terrible, but it sounded like a compliment. Her amusement and the chuckles from Mike and Jason created a mocking soundtrack to my humiliation. I was surrounded by people who were celebrating my son's cruelty. 28 years of a lifetime of care, all reduced to unwanted interference in front of an audience that found our family's destruction amusing. I turned away, and Brandon's laughter followed me as I walked toward the house. Something inside me had shifted. The hurt was turning into something colder and more calculating. He wanted me gone, and I decided that could be arranged, but not in the way he expected. The stairs creaked under my weight as I climbed to the second floor, the laughter from the party still echoing through the house. I closed my bedroom door, finally separating myself from the celebration of my own humiliation. The party noises were muffled now, quiet conversations and the sound of Brandon's voice cutting through it all with another joke at my expense. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized myself. When had I become this person, a doormat who absorbed insults and enabled disrespect by providing for someone who wanted me dead? The memories came flooding back. I remembered co-signing for a used car he couldn't afford and listening to him complain about it for months. I remembered a Christmas dinner where he had orchestrated a public mockery of me in front of his friends. But tonight was different. Tonight, he had finally said what he really thought, and something inside me had changed permanently. I looked down at the backyard and saw him with a fresh beer, probably recounting his latest victory over the old man. I saw them all, living in my house, eating my food, drinking my alcohol, and celebrating my public defeat. I wondered how many years I had been financing my own disrespect. My mind, trained as an engineer, began to engage, analyzing the variables and constraints. He wanted me gone, I wanted respect. The current approach of patience and generosity had failed completely. It was time for a new methodology. I looked in the mirror again, seeing not a victim, but a man with resources and the intelligence to use them. Brandon was 28 years old and had no job, no savings, and no credit history. His entire lifestyle depended on my willingness to subsidize his comfort while he publicly mocked me. What would happen if that subsidy disappeared? I owned the house outright. Every bill, every payment, was mine. The refrigerator, the internet, the electricity, it was all mine. If he wanted me gone, I would grant his wish, but on my terms. I walked out of the bedroom, my hand on the doorknob. The party below was oblivious to the shift that had just occurred. Brandon was about to learn the difference between independence and abandonment. He had asked for space from his father's influence, and soon he would have all the space he could handle. 25 minutes after I had left the party, I descended the stairs with measured steps, each one bringing me closer to a confrontation that would change everything. The back door opened to the same scene, music, drinks, and Brandon holding court near the barbecue. But something had changed in me. I walked directly to the sound system table. The music continued for a moment before I found the volume control. A sudden silence fell across the backyard. "The party is over," I announced into the wireless microphone. "I'm asking everyone to leave my property now." My words landed with the impact of a physical blow. Conversation stopped, beer bottles paused. Brandon's face went from surprise to embarrassment, then settled into his usual arrogance. He stepped forward and told everyone that nobody was going anywhere, that it was his party. Mike came to his side, telling me not to ruin his son's birthday. I simply replied into the microphone that it was my property and that I had the legal right to decide who stayed and who left. Jason laughed, telling me not to be so dramatic, but several other guests were starting to look uncomfortable. Brandon told me to put the microphone down and stop embarrassing myself. I responded, amplified for everyone to hear, that I owned the house and paid for everything. I said this was my property, not his, to which he replied, asking what difference it made. He said I had been supporting him for years, and that's what parents do. He played to his audience, saying I couldn't just kick people out. Samantha giggled from her table. I confirmed that yes, I could. I explained that any property owner had the right to ask people to leave, and if they refused, it became trespassing. He looked to his friends for support, but Mike's tone had changed. "You're not serious," Mike said. "You wouldn't actually call the cops on your son's birthday party." "Watch me," I replied, setting the microphone down. I told them they had 5 minutes to leave voluntarily, or the police will remove them as trespassers. Brandon's voice rose behind me, no longer confident but panicked. "Dad, you can't do this. These people are my friends." I paused at the door and looked over the gathering one last time, thinking about all the years I had hosted his friends and endured their disrespect in my own backyard. I looked at him and said that since he wanted me gone from his life, he would soon see how that would work. I explained that when I left, the house was coming with me. The back door closed quietly behind me, muting the loud voices that followed. I glanced through the kitchen window and watched guests look toward the house with uncertainty. Some of them were already moving toward the side gate. I went to the wall phone and dialed 911. About 25 minutes later, the flashing red and blue lights of a patrol car swept across the yard. The party's easygoing atmosphere vanished as guests noticed the vehicle pulling into my driveway. The first to come through the side gate was Officer James Miller, his uniform and badge immediately drawing everyone's attention. He was followed by his partner, Officer Linda Gark, who carried the unmistakable authority of legal power. Officer Miller asked who had called the police. I stepped forward from my spot by the back door and told them that I had. I explained that this was my property and that I had asked everyone to leave, but they had refused. Miller nodded, pulling out a small notepad as he looked over the group, who suddenly seemed very interested in their drinks. The music had completely stopped, and the only sounds were nervous laughter and whispered conversations. Officer Miller asked if I could prove ownership of the property, so I handed him my driver's license and a property tax statement. Officer Gark then stepped forward and announced with clear authority that everyone on the property must leave immediately, as I, the property owner, had asked them to go, and staying would be considered trespassing. The guests reacted in different ways. Some near the garden quickly began gathering their things, clearly uncomfortable with the police getting involved in what they had thought was just a family issue. Others looked at Brandon, unsure of what to do. Samantha's voice rose, complaining that it wasn't fair since they had permission to be there because Brandon had invited them. Officer Gark calmly explained to her that adult children living in their parents' homes do not have the legal right to invite guests against the property owner's wishes. Brandon then stepped forward, his earlier confidence shaken but not entirely gone. He told the officers that the situation was ridiculous, that it was his birthday party, and that I was just being difficult. Officer Miller, showing professional detachment, told my son that family arguments do not change property law. If I owned the property and wanted the guests to leave, they had to obey. I watched from near the house as the crowd started to thin out. About half the guests were already heading toward the gate, not wanting to be part of a police intervention. But Brandon's closest friends remained defiant. Mike and Jason stood with him like bodyguards, their loyalty seemingly stronger than their common sense. Samantha stayed nearby, holding her drink, as if the party could somehow continue. I asked Officer Miller how much time they had to leave. He replied that they usually allowed a reasonable amount of time for people to comply, but if they continued to refuse after being officially notified, it would become a more serious matter. The full meaning of that hung in the air. Brandon's face showed the first real signs of uncertainty as he thought about what a more serious matter might mean. He told me that I couldn't actually have them arrested for having a party, but the confidence that had carried him through our earlier arguments had noticeably diminished. I responded honestly that I was not having anyone arrested, I was just exercising my legal rights as the property owner. What happened next would be up to them and whether they chose to respect my rights. Officer Gark looked at her watch and told the remaining guests that those who wished to leave should do so now, and anyone still present in 5 minutes would be in violation of trespassing laws. The announcement caused another group to leave. Even some of Brandon's supporters started to move toward the gate, as the threat of real legal consequences was too much. Brandon looked at his shrinking group of friends, finally starting to understand the reality of his situation. But instead of giving in, he crossed his arms and stood his ground. He announced to the officers that he lived there and that it was his home, too. Officer Miller's patience had worn thin. He moved closer to Brandon, his hand near his handcuffs. He told my son that he was breaking the law and that this was his final opportunity to leave voluntarily. Brandon's response was as arrogant as ever, but now it was tinged with genuine legal danger. He told them he wasn't going anywhere and that they couldn't arrest someone for being in their own house. Officer Gark then moved to Brandon's side and said that they could, since he didn't own the property and had been ordered to leave by the legal owner. The reality of his situation seemed to hit Brandon suddenly. His eyes darted between the two officers, then toward me, and then to his friends, who watched in stunned silence. He asked me to tell them they were crazy, that he lived here. I replied calmly that he lived here with my permission, and that I was now withdrawing that permission. Officer Miller stepped forward with the handcuffs visible and told him to turn around and put his hands behind his back. Brandon's voice cracked a little as he asked if they were serious and if they were really going to arrest him. Officer Miller simply told him to turn around. The moment was tense. I watched my son's face move through disbelief, anger, and finally a desperate panic as he realized that 28 years of avoiding consequences had just come to an end. He slowly turned around, his movements stiff with resentment. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut echoed across the empty patio. Officer Miller told him that he was under arrest for criminal trespassing and for failing to comply with a lawful order. Samantha gasped and told me that this couldn't be happening and that I couldn't let them arrest my own son. I met her gaze calmly and told her that I was not letting them do anything. I had called them specifically because Brandon had refused to respect my property rights. As the officers began walking Brandon toward the gate, he twisted around to look at me, his face showing a genuine hatred I had never seen before. He told me he would never forgive me, that I thought I had won something, but that I had just made the biggest mistake of my life. The venom in his voice would have devastated me just hours before, but now it simply confirmed that I had made the right decision. A son who could speak to his father with such hatred while being arrested for trespassing on his own father's property had lost any right to family loyalty. I simply told him that we would see. Officer Miller opened the back door of the patrol car and guided Brandon's head as he climbed into the back seat. Through the window, I could see my son's face, twisted in rage, his mouth moving as if he was making more threats that I was grateful not to hear. Mike stepped forward, asking how long Brandon would be held and when they could bail him out. Officer Gark replied that it depended on the charges and the judge's decision, but criminal trespassing could result in up to 2 weeks in county jail, plus fines. The thought of a 2-week sentence gave me a sense of perfect satisfaction. 2 weeks would give me enough time to make the changes I had been thinking about. The patrol car's engine started, and the red and blue lights began flashing again as it backed out of my driveway. I watched as my son was driven away, finally facing real consequences for his choices. Samantha was crying near the party decorations, and Mike and Jason were gathering empty bottles with confused urgency. The party was over in every sense of the word, and my backyard belonged to me again. Within minutes, even Brandon's closest friends had gathered their belongings and left. The music equipment was silent, the barbecue grill was cooling, and paper plates and plastic cups were scattered on surfaces I would be cleaning the next day. But that night, I stood alone in my reclaimed space, listening to the silence that had replaced years of disrespectful noise. The real work was just beginning. The first morning without Brandon's presence felt like I was in a completely different house. Coffee brewed in absolute silence while I sat at the kitchen table, no longer listening for complaints or demands from upstairs. A quick phone call to the county clerk's office confirmed what Officer Gark had mentioned. Brandon would serve 14 days for criminal trespassing and disorderly conduct. His release date was scheduled for April 29 at 9 a.m. 14 days, exactly 2 weeks to implement the plan that had been forming in my mind during his arrest. Over the next few days, I began working with the same methodical precision that had defined my engineering career. The first step was to gather information about Brandon's actual situation versus the fantasy he had been living. I pulled out financial records for the past 5 years. The rent he would have paid in our neighborhood was around $2,800 a month. Utilities averaged $350, and the food I had covered for him was roughly $400 a month. With insurance, maintenance, property taxes, and incidental expenses, the true cost of his living was approximately $4,200 per month, or $50,000 annually. That was what supporting Brandon's unemployment had cost me, not including his parties, gas money, and various financial emergencies. During this research phase, I also looked into the real estate market. Similar houses in our neighborhood were selling for between $820,000 and $880,000. Mine, which was meticulously maintained and recently updated, would likely sell for the higher end of that range. The memory that kept coming to mind during these quiet planning sessions was the job fair incident from last November. I had driven Brandon to 3 different job opportunities, waited patiently while he submitted applications, and even helped him practice for the interviews. He had returned from each interview with a reason why the job wasn't suitable: the manager seemed like a micromanager, the pay was insulting, or the commute would eat up his salary. Within a week, a friend told me that Brandon had intentionally sabotaged each interview, arriving late, dressed improperly, and giving flippant answers to ensure he wasn't hired. When I confronted him, his response was brutally honest. He asked why he would take a minimum wage job when I provided everything he needed. That conversation should have been the wake-up call, but instead, I had accepted his logic and continued to enable the very behavior that was destroying any possibility of mutual respect between us. By the end of the first week of his incarceration, my decision was completely clear. Brandon had wanted me to disappear from his life. He had said it publicly and with enough cruelty to show he meant it. I would disappear, but not as the defeated father he expected to manipulate forever. The house would be sold while he was in county jail, completely unaware that his free ride was ending for good. The money from the sale would fund a comfortable retirement for me somewhere far from California, a place he would never think to look for a father he had wanted to vanish. I spent the second week researching retirement communities in different states, places with reasonable living costs and no connections to my current life. Brandon's threats during his arrest had made one thing perfectly clear: he saw me as an obstacle to be overcome, not a father to be respected. He had promised that I would regret enforcing boundaries, and that was the kind of manipulative language I had been tolerating for years. But this time, there would be no backing down, no compromise, and no erosion of my resolve through emotional manipulation. My engineering approach to the problem was simple: remove the variable causing the system to malfunction. In this case, the variable was my continued financial support for someone who openly despised the person providing it. As Brandon's release date approached, I finalized my research and confirmed my decision. A real estate agent's business card sat next to my morning coffee, waiting for the phone call that would set everything in motion. 28 years of patient guidance, financial support, and unconditional love had produced nothing but entitlement, disrespect, and threats of retaliation when boundaries were finally enforced. It was time to show Brandon what disappearing actually looked like. I picked up the phone to call Michelle Johnson, the real estate agent whose online reviews suggested she was efficient and quick at sales. Michelle Johnson's office was located in downtown San Jose. Professional certificates lined the walls alongside photos of sold properties, creating a very competent atmosphere. She thanked me for calling and asked what was driving the need for a quick sale. I explained that it was a family matter that required immediate action. Her expression remained neutral, a skill that had likely served her well. She said she understood and that she would review my property details so we could discuss realistic expectations. The property evaluation took about 40 minutes of market analysis, neighborhood comparisons, and discussions about pricing. Michelle's expertise was obvious in her systematic approach. Based on current market conditions and the property details I had provided, she recommended a listing price of $850,000, saying that with proper marketing, we should attract serious buyers within a week. The timeline aligned exactly with my private deadline. I agreed to the price and leaned forward slightly, explaining that I was prepared to offer her a significant bonus if the sale closed within 7 days. Her eyes brightened with professional enthusiasm. I told her I would give her $5,000 above her standard commission if we had a signed contract by next Tuesday. She replied that she was committed and that she would visit the property that afternoon to conduct a proper evaluation. The 20-minute drive to my house was through familiar neighborhoods that would soon become memories. She followed in her own car with her professional camera equipment visible. Walking through my home with someone evaluating its market value was unexpectedly emotional. Every room held memories of Brandon's childhood, his birthday parties, his homework sessions, the gradual transformation from a grateful child to an entitled adult. Michelle said that the maintenance level was exceptional and that the property would show beautifully. She asked if I had considered professional staging, and I replied that whatever she recommended would be fine, since cost was not the primary concern. She moved through each room efficiently, noting architectural details and natural lighting. Her assessment confirmed what my research had suggested: the house was perfectly positioned for a rapid sale. She told me that properties in that condition don't stay on the market for long and that she was confident we would have multiple offers by the weekend. Multiple offers meant a potential bidding war, which could drive the final price even higher than we had targeted. Brandon's 2-week sentence was providing advantages I hadn't even anticipated. Back in her office, we went through the contract negotiation efficiently. Standard seller forms, marketing agreements, and timeline specifications filled the afternoon with productive legal documentation. Michelle explained that she would have professional photographs taken the next morning, and the listing would go live on Thursday, with an open house scheduled for Saturday and Sunday. She said that due to the urgency and bonus structure, this property would get absolute priority in her schedule. The signed contracts felt substantial in my hands as I prepared to leave her office. 7 days remained until Brandon's scheduled release, and the mechanism for his ultimate lesson in consequences was now legally documented and professionally managed. As I paused at her office door, she asked if I was planning to relocate, as it seemed like more than just downsizing. I replied truthfully that it was a complete life change. She nodded with the kind of understanding that comes from dealing with clients in major transitions. She said that she would make sure the transition went as smoothly as possible. Before I left, I told her that I might need to coordinate the timing very precisely. Can you keep me updated on any interested buyers immediately? Absolutely. You'll have real-time updates on every showing, every inquiry, every offer. This is going to move fast. I walked to my car with the satisfaction of someone who had just converted years of planning into concrete action. The house that had sheltered Brandon's entitlement for 28 years would soon belong to strangers who actually appreciated having a place to call home. Now, I needed to learn exactly when Brandon would be released so I could time the final phase perfectly. The drive to Santa Clara County Jail took 30 minutes through morning traffic that gave me time to prepare for what would likely be my final interaction with any aspect of Brandon's current circumstances. The facility emerged from the industrial landscape like a concrete monument to consequences, exactly what my son would soon understand intimately. Security procedures required identification, verification, metal detector screening, and visitor registration that transformed citizens into processed subjects within the institutional system. The efficiency impressed me with its methodical approach to human management. I need information about an inmate, I told the corrections officer at the visitor information desk, sliding my driver's license across the polished counter. Sergeant Davis, no relation, despite the shared surname, reviewed my identification with the professional neutrality that characterized every aspect of this sterile environment. His uniform and badge represented an authority that transcended personal feelings or family dynamics. Name of the inmate, Brandon Davis. He's serving 2 weeks for criminal trespassing. The sergeant's fingers moved across his computer keyboard with practiced efficiency, accessing databases that contained every detail of Brandon's current legal situation. The institutional system had reduced my son to a number, a cell assignment, and a release schedule. Brandon Davis, booked April 15th, his eyes scanned the monitor without emotion. Your son will be released April 29th at 9 a.m. Perfect. The timing aligned exactly with my strategic requirements. Thank you for that information. Is there anything else I should know about the release process? Standard release procedures. He'll be processed out through this same building. Return personal effects. Given transportation voucher if requested. Sergeant Davis looked up from his screen with the kind of helpful efficiency that marked quality public service. Would you like to visit with him while you're here? The question hung in the air between us like smoke from an extinguished fire. Here was my opportunity to see Brandon face to face, to gauge his emotional state, perhaps even to prepare him for what awaited his return home. No, that won't be necessary, for words that severed whatever remained of traditional parental obligation. Sergeant Davis showed no reaction to my refusal. Family dynamics weren't part of his professional concern, only procedural compliance and information distribution. Visiting hours are daily from 2 to 4 p.m. If you change your mind, he offered with the same neutral helpfulness he'd shown throughout our interaction. I appreciate the information, but I have everything I need. The conversation concluded with the institutional efficiency that had marked its beginning. No personal questions, no judgment about family relationships, no curiosity about my reasons for gathering release information without visiting my incarcerated son. Walking back through the security checkpoints felt like emerging from a controlled environment designed to strip away individual identity and personal choice. Brandon had spent 10 days in this system that reduced humans to numbers and schedules, learning what accountability actually meant in practical terms. The drive home provided time to calculate final timeline coordination. April 29th, 9 a.m. Brandon would be processed out of county jail, expecting to return to the house that had sheltered his entitlement for 28 years. Instead, he would discover that his father had finally taken his advice about disappearing from his life. Michelle's real estate expertise suggested the property would likely sell by the weekend, giving me several days to coordinate closing procedures with Brandon's release timing. The house that had enabled his disrespect would belong to strangers who appreciated having a place to call home. The engineering precision of this revenge plan satisfied every aspect of my methodical nature: variables controlled, timelines synchronized, resources allocated efficiently, and desired outcome guaranteed through legal channels that Brandon himself had initiated. Back in my driveway, I sat in the car for a moment, contemplating the house that would soon cease to be my responsibility. Every mortgage payment, every utility bill, every maintenance expense had subsidized someone who wished I would disappear from his life forever. Tomorrow I would coordinate with Michelle about showing schedules and potential buyer interest. The institutional visit had confirmed that Brandon remained exactly where consequences had placed him, unaware that his father was implementing the ultimate lesson in gratitude and respect. By the time he walked out of county jail next Tuesday morning, the home he'd taken for granted would be in escrow to buyers who actually wanted to live there. My phone rang as I reached the front door. Michelle's name appeared on the caller ID, probably with updates about buyer interest in showing appointments. "Michelle speaking," came the cheerful voice through my phone as I stepped through my front door for what would likely be the last time as its owner. "Robert Davis, you called. Wonderful news. The Garcia family has accepted our asking price. Full cash offer, no contingencies. Closing tomorrow morning at 9:30. Perfect timing." Brandon would be released at 9, giving him just enough time to return home before discovering that home no longer existed in any meaningful sense. "Excellent work, Michelle. That bonus is well earned." The next 24 hours compressed into a whirlwind of final arrangements that would have impressed any project manager: moving trucks, document signing, key transfers, and the careful coordination of a revenge plan 2 weeks in the making. Carlos and Maria Garcia arrived with their 2 children and a moving truck filled with the hopeful energy that comes with starting fresh in a new home. Their excitement reminded me of my own feelings when I'd first bought this house 30 years ago, back when Brandon was still grateful for bedtime stories and birthday parties. "Mr. Davis, thank you so much for accepting our offer quickly," Maria said as their kids ran through what had been Brandon's childhood home. "We know you were in a hurry to sell. Life circumstances change rapidly sometimes." I handed Carlos the garage door opener and house keys, feeling the symbolic weight of transferring ownership to people who would actually appreciate living here. "I do have one small favor to ask." "Of course, anything." "My son is traveling and may stop by tomorrow, not knowing about the sale. Could you give him this note?" I handed Maria a sealed envelope with Brandon's name written in my careful engineering script. She accepted it with the kind of helpful courtesy that characterized people who understood the complexity of family logistics during major life transitions. The note's contents had been carefully crafted over several drafts: brief, emotionally neutral, and devastatingly final. "Brandon, you said you wanted me to disappear from your life forever. I've decided to grant your wish. The house has been sold. I am traveling extensively and will be unreachable indefinitely. You now have the independence you've always demanded. Robert." 40 words that summarize 28 years of financial support, emotional investment, and accumulated disrespect. No forwarding address, no explanation of timeline, no opportunity for negotiation or emotional manipulation. After the Garcia family settled into their new home, I walked next door to Frank Collins's house with a single suitcase and a request that would position me perfectly for tomorrow's revelation. Frank had been my neighbor for 15 years, a reliable man who helped with snow removal and accepted packages when I traveled for work. Our friendship operated on the comfortable level of mutual respect without excessive personal intrusion. "Can I stay with you for a couple of days, Frank? I'm between living situations." "Of course, old friend. What happened with the house?" He stepped aside to let me enter his familiar living room, where I'd occasionally shared coffee and neighborhood gossip over the years. I sold it. Time for major changes in my life. His expression showed genuine concern mixed with curiosity. But Frank had always possessed the wisdom to avoid prying into personal matters that weren't offered freely. What about Brandon? Where will he stay when he gets back from wherever he's been? Brandon is an adult. He'll figure out his own arrangements. Something in my tone must have conveyed the finality of that statement because Frank nodded without pursuing the subject further. His guest room was comfortable and, more importantly, positioned with a perfect view of my former home's front entrance. That evening, I sat by Frank's window, watching the Garcia family unpack boxes and arrange furniture in rooms where Brandon had spent years taking my generosity for granted. Tomorrow morning he would walk up that driveway expecting to resume his comfortable lifestyle of unemployment subsidized by parental enabling. Instead, he would meet strangers who owned everything he'd assumed would always be available for his use. The engineering precision of this revenge plan satisfied every aspect of my methodical nature, variables controlled, timelines synchronized, resources allocated efficiently, and desired outcome guaranteed through legal channels that Brandon himself had initiated. Frank knocked on the guest room door around 10 p.m., bringing fresh towels and the kind of practical hospitality that had characterized our entire friendship. "Everything you need in here, Robert." "Everything's perfect, Frank. Thank you for the accommodation. Stay as long as necessary. Whatever is going on with your family situation, you've got support here." He left me alone with my thoughts and my view of the house where Brandon expected to continue living at my expense. Tomorrow would bring the ultimate lesson in consequences, delivered with the same precision I'd once applied to solving complex engineering problems. The last thing I saw before turning off the lights was Maria Garcia closing the curtains in what had been Brandon's bedroom window. 9:30 arrived with the precision I'd spent 2 weeks orchestrating. From Frank's upstairs window, I watched Brandon round the corner onto our street, walking with the casual confidence of someone returning to familiar territory. He looked exactly as I'd expected after 2 weeks in county jail, slightly thinner, wearing the same clothes he'd been arrested in, carrying a small plastic bag containing whatever personal items they'd returned to him. His posture showed no trace of humility or reflection, just the eager anticipation of someone ready to resume his comfortable lifestyle. Brandon approached the front walkway without hesitation, pulling out keys that would no longer work in locks that were no longer his to open. The sight of him reaching confidently for a door that belonged to strangers struck me as the perfect metaphor for everything wrong with our relationship. The Garcia children were playing in the front yard while Carlos unloaded boxes from their truck. The sound of unfamiliar voices speaking Spanish made Brandon pause, his expression shifting from confidence to confusion as he processed the scene before him. "Excuse me." His voice carried the entitled tone I'd heard countless times when he wanted something from people he considered beneath his attention. "Who are you people? And what are you doing in my house?" Carlos straightened from the moving box he'd been lifting, his expression showing the polite confusion of someone encountering an unexpected situation. "Sorry, friend, but this is our house now. We bought it last week." "That's impossible." Brandon's voice rose with the kind of indignation he'd perfected over years of having his reality challenged by inconvenient facts. "I live here. This is my family's home." Maria appeared in the doorway, clearly drawn by the commotion in her front yard. She took in Brandon's agitated state with the practical assessment of a mother who dealt with countless neighborhood disputes and childhood conflicts. "Are you Brandon Davis?" she asked with the careful politeness that characterized her entire approach to this awkward situation. "Yes, finally, someone with sense. Now, please explain why strangers are in my house with all their belongings. The previous owner left something for you." Maria disappeared briefly into the house, returning with the sealed envelope that contained 2 weeks of careful planning, condensed into 40 devastating words. Brandon accepted the envelope with the suspicious reluctance of someone who'd learned to expect bad news from official-looking documents. His fingers trembled slightly as he tore open the seal, the first physical sign that some part of him understood this moment would change everything. I leaned forward against Frank's window, watching my son's face as he read the note that would complete his education in consequences and gratitude. Brandon, you said you wanted me to disappear from your life forever. I've decided to grant your wish. The house has been sold. I am traveling extensively and will be unreachable indefinitely. You now have the independence you've always demanded. Robert. The progression across his features was exactly what I'd anticipated: confusion, disbelief, growing comprehension, and finally devastating realization. 28 years of financial dependence, emotional manipulation, and casual disrespect had led to this moment, where Brandon finally understood the true cost of taking his father's love and support for granted. This can't be real. His voice had lost all trace of entitlement, replaced by something approaching panic. He can't just sell our house and disappear. That's not how families work. Sir, I'm sorry for your situation, Carlos said with genuine sympathy. But we have all the legal paperwork. The sale was completed yesterday morning. Brandon's legs seemed to give out slightly, forcing him to lean against the mailbox that no longer belonged to his family. The plastic bag from the jail fell from his grip, spilling his few possessions onto the sidewalk that had once led to his front door. Where am I supposed to live? How am I supposed to eat? The questions came out as desperate whispers rather than the demands I'd grown accustomed to hearing. Maria and Carlos exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with witnessing this family crisis, but uncertain how to help someone whose father had deliberately orchestrated his homelessness. From my hidden position, I felt a complex mixture of satisfaction and unexpected sympathy. The justice was perfect. Brandon had received exactly what he'd claimed to want. But watching his complete emotional collapse stirred something uncomfortably close to paternal concern. He stood there on the sidewalk, reading and rereading the note, as if repetition might change its contents. The house behind him buzzed with the activity of a family who appreciated having a place to call home, while he faced the reality of having nowhere to go. 28 years of enabling had ended with 40 words in a sold house. The lesson in consequences was complete, delivered with the same precision I'd once applied to solving complex engineering problems. Brandon folded the note carefully and walked away without another word to the Garcia family. Hours passed before I could step away from Frank's window. Brandon had disappeared around the corner, but the image of his tears remained burned into my memory like an unexpected photograph. He'd cried. Not the angry, manipulative tears I'd witnessed during childhood tantrums, but genuine heartbroken sobs of someone who'd finally understood the true cost of his choices. For 28 years, I'd wondered if any authentic emotion existed beneath his entitled exterior. The answer had arrived precisely when it no longer mattered. Frank found me in his kitchen that evening, staring at a cup of coffee that had grown cold, while I processed the complex aftermath of successful revenge. Rough day watching the neighborhood drama, he asked with the careful tone of someone who suspected more than he was willing to say directly. Something like that. The young man seemed pretty upset about losing his family home. I met Frank's eyes, seeing the genuine concern of someone who'd witnessed pain without understanding its origins. Sometimes consequences take years to arrive, but they always do eventually. Frank nodded with the wisdom of someone who'd lived long enough to understand that justice rarely arrives on schedule, but rarely fails to arrive at all. Thank you for the hospitality, I said, rising from the table where I'd spent so many hours planning and plotting. I'm moving on tomorrow morning. Where are you headed, Robert? To the ocean. Time to start completely fresh. Frank didn't press for details, understanding instinctively that some life changes require privacy rather than explanation. His friendship had provided exactly the support I needed during this transition, without demanding more information than I was willing to share. You've got my number if you need anything, he offered, though we both understood this goodbye carried the permanence of someone choosing to leave his entire past behind. The next morning arrived with the kind of California sunshine that makes new beginnings seem not just possible but inevitable. I loaded my single suitcase into the car I'd barely driven during 2 weeks of strategic planning, feeling lighter than I had in decades. Frank appeared on his porch as I backed out of his driveway, raising a hand in farewell that carried 30 years of neighborly respect compressed into a single gesture. I waved back, genuinely grateful for his unwitting support during the most complex moral decision of my life. The highway stretched west toward the Pacific, carrying me away from everything I'd known toward possibilities I hadn't dared imagine 2 weeks ago. $850,000 in my bank account, no family obligations, no one depending on my financial support or emotional availability. Brandon had gotten exactly what he'd claimed to want, a father who disappeared from his life forever. I'd granted his birthday wish with the same engineering precision I'd once applied to solving complex technical problems. The justice was perfect, delivered through natural consequences rather than malicious revenge. Yet his tears had changed something fundamental in the equation, not the outcome, that remained fixed and appropriate, but my understanding of who he was beneath the entitlement had shifted in those final moments when authentic emotion replaced practiced manipulation. He was still my son despite everything, still capable of genuine feeling, despite years of evidence suggesting otherwise. Still human despite behavior that had often seemed calculatedly cruel. That recognition didn't change my decision to leave, or my conviction that consequences were necessary and appropriate, but it added a layer of complexity to what had started as simple justice and evolved into something approaching wisdom. The coastal highway appeared ahead, promising miles of ocean views and small towns where no one knew my history or expected me to subsidize anyone's lifestyle. Communities where 62 years of accumulated experience might be valued rather than exploited. I'd spent 28 years enabling someone who wished I would disappear. Now I was granting that wish while creating the life I should have built for myself decades ago. The morning sun reflected off my windshield as I drove toward whatever came next, carrying nothing but the clothes in my suitcase and the hard-earned knowledge that respect once lost can only be reclaimed through actions rather than words. Behind me, Brandon was learning the same lesson from the other direction. Ahead, the ocean waited with horizons I'd never explored and possibilities I'd never considered. It was time to find out who I was when no one needed anything from me.